Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam Oster, and I am the Community Engagement Librarian for the Library of Michigan. And I want to welcome those who are viewing this recording to our conversation with 2023 Michigan Notable Book author Kelsey Ronan, who is the author of Chevy in the Hole, one of the 20 titles that were on the 2023 Michigan Notable Books list. So we're going to be having a bit of a conversation with Kelsey and learn a little bit more about her time as an author and a little bit more about her writing process. So welcome, Kelsey. And I was wondering if you could just kind of start us out with talking a little bit more about your background. How did you become a writer? A little bit more about that part of you as you've gotten into this experience as an author.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. Being a Michigan Notable Book author has been like really cool. I'm just fresh off of the summer library tour, which was so much fun. I think that I became a writer because I grew up in a family of storytellers. No professional writers. We're a Flint family, very blue collar. But I kind of grew up between my grandfather who worked for the automotive industry. He was a foreman at Ford, and my mom was a bus driver. And they were both people who were like, you have your day job, but then your real life is at home with your family, and like the life of the mind of like reading and exploring ideas. So I grew up just surrounded by books and storytelling, and my mom took us to the Flint Public Library all the time. So yeah, I don't really remember like a moment where a very precocious young me was like, this is it, I'm going to be a writer when I grow up. I was just always sort of like scribbling stories in notebooks. And when I got to college and I went to University of Michigan Flint and had amazing poet and essayist and novelist Jan Worth Nelson. She became a mentor to a very young me, and really encouraged me and like impressed upon me that what I was doing, that there was something there, and I followed that and explored it.
Have you ever looked back at some of your early writing and seen transition or changes, or do you feel that a lot of it's kind of stayed relatively the same?
I prefer not to think about it. My mom just she retired last year, and she moved out of the house in Flint I grew up in. And when she was like going through the process of clearing out the house, that was one of my continued recurring, I'll say, like anxiety attacks. Was like, there have to be so many incriminating and cringe-some like notebooks and boxes in that house, and like I better get in there and like find them and throw them away.
So you'd like everybody to think, you were already an all-star when this came out.
I mean, honestly, like even I can't read from Chevy in the Hole too. It's been out for a little bit over a year now. But even reading it every single time, there's a little voice in the back of my head that's like, ooh, this line could have been better.
Yeah.
Like, see, people aren't laughing. That's not really funny. I'm always like revising in my head, and like, the next thing is going to be better.
So in a way that kind of makes, having that criticism kind of really does get into a bit of how you write and your writing process. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about that? Like, what is it that what is sort of your formula for writing, if you were to kind of explain that to somebody who was a budding writer, and kind of how you really kind of nail that down?
Yeah, it's funny. I was very lucky to go to the LA Times Book Fest this year. I was on a panel about writing the Midwest, and I was very, very lucky to be on a panel with Lan Samantha Chang. And there was a question about like, what kind of writer are you? Like, are you someone who intensely like structures everything and takes notes, or are you starting from the beginning and seeing where it goes? And I of course, I'm sitting on this panel with all these people like Sam Chang who have multiple books and these amazing careers.
Mhm.
And I have one book, and I was just in real time realizing like, oh, I guess I'm figuring out now what kind of writer I am. I've only done it once, so I
Yeah.
don't know. I know there's so many, and when part of my writing journey, I did do an MFA, Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Purdue, and we would have, of course, in addition to the faculty there, we'd have writers visiting a lot, and that would always be a question of like, what's your process? What's your ritual?
Mhm.
And there's so much like you got to write every day. If it means like getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, like having a couple hours before your kids get up or before you go to your day job or whatever you do, or burning the midnight oil. I haven't yet established that kind of
Mhm.
rhythm. If I ever will, I
Yeah.
find I go through periods. I'm kind of in one right now where I write a lot. I'm like really obsessed with an
Mhm.
idea, and I go to bed thinking about it and I wake up thinking about it, and whatever time I have to myself, I'm like either writing or I'm on a walk and I'm taking notes on my phone. But then I can go like weeks or months without writing,
Mhm.
and I'm just reading a lot and absorbing more and kind of taking things in.
So
Um,
it's not necessarily like if we walked into your office or wherever that you write that there would be a whole bunch of sticky notes that are just in a line on the wall. It's much more internal in a way.
Yeah, I don't even have a desk. I'm like it's me and my laptop like on the couch or in bed, or when the weather's nice, like on my front porch, or I'm part of a collective of women, non-binary and trans folks in Detroit called Room Project.
Okay.
Um, so I get to write there a lot, but no, it's a little more chaos with me.
I do have to admit I got to go to another author visit from one of your fellow 2023 notable book authors, and they mentioned, I won't say who because I don't want to I don't want to put that out there if they didn't, but they said that they had gotten at one point like 30 pages into one of their books. I don't know if it was this one or their previous one, and they found out that there was a complete there was something that just totally messed with the timeline of what was going on in the book, and they had to delete it all because they're the type of writer that just they're typing away and just go, and they don't have necessarily an established formula. So have you ever had that moment where you're like, oh crap, this will not make sense?
Oh, totally. This is the thing I've shared a lot on the book tour, and various expressions of horror from people,
Mhm.
writers and not writers, whenever I say this. But when I thought I was done with Chevy in the Hole, it was 100 pages longer. So
Mhm.
once it went through my agent and then the editor, I'm an overwriter, and there was a lot of like, let's cut this, let's like
Mhm.
shape this up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very used to that feeling. 30 pages sounds like nothing. Way more.
Well, I like you said, having 100 pages more that gives you a lot to work with. But does that then give you future ideas for if you were going to be writing? I don't know if you have plans for a sequel to this or not in any way, or other writing connected to it. But are there things that got cut out and you're like, I'm going to hold on to that for another point? Some other story may come out of that.
I think most of the work for this book, most of the work that got cut was character building.
Mhm.
So there wasn't so much that I was like, ooh, I will come back to that, or that's its own story, but was more like it was the work I think I needed to do to like fully inhabit those characters.
Yeah.
Um, so the reader didn't necessarily need to be there with me, but
Yeah.
that as part of the drafting process, like I needed to do that work to like think through the family connections, or to think through moments of crisis in their life or moments of joy,
Mhm.
and to kind of have all that internalized so I could write from their points of view more
Yeah.
fluidly.
Well, then, why don't we talk about just the origins? How did you get the idea of Chevy in the Hole? What was the origin story of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in my 20s, especially like when I went to Indiana for grad school,
Mhm.
I was writing exclusively about Flint, and I think it was coming from a place of homesickness. I'd had quite a lot of loss for being 25.
Mhm.
My grandfather, who I mentioned, he'd passed away, and then my fiance had died very suddenly when I was 24. Um, and being like removed from Flint, where I'd spent my whole life, and processing these losses, I started to write about Brian, who had passed. I started to write these family stories. I was really um, kind of frantically trying to capture everything I remembered my grandfather used to tell, like his own stories
Mhm.
about traveling through North Africa in the 50s, or his family history stories of how he was born in Detroit. He was
Mhm.
one of 9 children, big Irish Catholic family, and they moved up to Flint in the 30s to so his dad could sell pots and pans door to door, like happens in the book.
Yeah.
And in trying to capture those stories, it opened up so many questions, although like places I didn't know, things I didn't know, the gaps in the stories, things I didn't remember or didn't think to ask. And it became a place on the page to fill those in with my imagination or with
Mhm.
research and thinking through through the process of like digging in the Flint Public Library's oral archives, for instance, or documentaries I found online, kind of more of what the sort of context for some of
Mhm.
the stories would be. Yeah, and then when the water crisis happened, and I had personally so much fear, it affected my immediate family really deeply. I was living not in Flint at the time, so I was coming home more and more to be with them and to be part of the protests. Um, and there was so much focus on the narrative,
Mhm.
not in Flint, but more nationally, about Flint is this like ghost town,
Mhm.
and this kind of dismissive storytelling about who's still in Flint and why, and this like overshadowing of the downsizing of General
Mhm.
Motors. And I got sort of defensive about that and thinking like it is true. I'm not here to like rah rah Flint and like gloss over very
Mhm.
real problems. And many thousands of people have left the city in my lifetime. But there's also 80,000 people still there, and what keeps them there?
Yeah.
Um, and it's not a ghost town. So I started to get really fixated on like writing a Flint story about the people who stayed. And as I got into that work, it was essential to me that however sad or
Mhm.
melancholy a story it might be, whatever problems these characters face, like it was moving toward a happy ending.
Mhm. So, I mean, kind of building on that, and you said this is very much a Flint story. Then what then should people who are not from Flint, like myself, I'm from the west side of the state, so my experiences with Flint will um sadly been very little. And there's so much, even just from the book itself, that you glean that, like, yeah, there are so many things out of here that people should know about this place, whether currently or in the past. What do you think readers should be gleaning most from out of it,
Mm,
about Flint itself, or the characters, or I should say the people, things like that?
I want people to, if they're not from Flint, I would like them to put the book down with the sense that whether they like the book or not, I hope they like the book. But if it wasn't for them, it's at least like complicated, um,
Hmm.
or enriched, what they knew about Flint already. I think Flint's a place that's had its story told like through the lens of tragedy and through these sort of larger like national media sort of outlets. So what does it mean? This Flint story from a Flint native that's trying to tell the history of the city. And if you are from Flint and you read it, again, whether you like it or not, I hope it feels authentic to you. I hope you see yourself. I hope you see your city within it. It's been so fun, like talking to people who either live in Flint now or have lived or just have some like personal connection to the city. Like as I've traveled around Michigan, like hearing people say like, oh, and I remembered like I totally like lived on this street that they pass in the book, or I remember Auto World, or I went to school at University of Michigan Flint downtown. I think there's so much of literature that's like in New York or London or Paris or wherever, and the author writes as if the reader knows like all these streets, like they're of this sort of universal knowledge. And I wanted to try and write a book about Flint in that same way.
That give like a greater sense of personal ownership to those that are that have been there or have that connection to Flint.
Yeah.
So there's been many things that kind of have gone into play with how you've described developing this book. How would you kind of define it as a work? Because it seems like you certainly have a lot of personal things from either your own life or other things that are part of it, but then you're also using the place itself. Like you, in a way, this is kind of like to me, it kind of seems a bit like a quasi memoir through fiction. But also there's so much history that's part of it, and because you have a whole story that you could have wrote a memoir in a sense about. But how when you look at this, how do you define this if you were to give it a sort of a singular, this is what I think of this work? Or it doesn't have that.
There were times like, especially it took me a long time to write the book. I started it in my 20s. I'm in my 30s now. The world changed around me. Flint's changed. I've changed. And as a writer in her 30s, determined to finish the project, I don't know that I would have had the same like audacity to write this intergenerational family story of two families and all these moments in like civil rights history and the history of the city and the automotive industry's history. I would get like a little overwhelmed by that and be like, oh my God, what am I doing? So I would just tell myself like, this is the story of how a young man decided to quit smoking. Because in the first chapter, he smokes. By the end of the book, he doesn't anymore. So what's that journey? My publisher has called it a love letter.
Okay.
And at first I was like, I don't know how I feel about that, because love letter sounds like love song and sounds sort of like syrupy or simple to me. But I think I'm on board with it as a love letter if it's like love in the way you experience after you've had your heart broken. It's like love when things aren't always going to be what you want, and you're going to have to
reconcile a lot of things.
There you go.
Yeah. I think a lot of people can relate to that and have that, because, well, let's face it, life is always complex. There's so much that we have to internally reconcile, and I think that the experiences of Flint, past and present, certainly show, as you've said, the complexities of this city and the people that are there. Do you have any favorite characters or favorite part of the book? Something they're like, yeah, this is really fun writing this, like I love diving into and creating this.
I mean, I just referenced him, the young man who stopped smoking, August Malloy, who's the sort of one of the two main characters of the book, and he's the first character you meet. He and I are very different people, but I think we have like some of the same preoccupations and same anxieties. And so I don't know, there was something about like writing from his perspective that I just found really fun. I think he's someone who sometimes is so sensitive. He struggles to like exist in the world and is so kind of fully in his own mind, but sometimes that can be really beautiful because when you're so in your own kind of fantasy, but you get that glimmer of hope, and it can be so idealistic. You can have so many big dreams. I think he's also someone who tries to like use humor to deflect and diffuse tension, especially in his family, and just like getting into that dynamic was really fun to write.
So what does it mean to have your work selected as a Michigan Notable Book? Something that I think you mentioned before, because I had the opportunity to go to one of your author visits, was how it sort of gave a resurgence, which was really cool. So just overall, what does it mean having been selected for the list, and how has it kind of changed how the trajectory of the book has gone?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on what you were saying about when we met in Frankenmuth, and I was telling you about this, like my book came out in March of 2022. So I didn't know what I was doing. The pandemic was it's still not over, but it was at that point still like I was, for some people, some bookstores, I was like the first in-person event they'd had in 2 years or whatever. So I felt a little like, what am I doing? I think in some of the venues I was in, it was sort of like, is this okay?
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of like trying to defeat my own introverted nature and my own nature, like, just go for it, just go.
Yeah.
So it's so nice to get a second tour and to like have this opportunity. It feels like relaunching the book, but with like a do-over. Like I've already done this, so now I can do it smarter and with better outfits. And it's been so incredibly moving too. The libraries that I've visited, all of them, the library hosts like a book club in advance. So not just going and reading work to people I've never met before, but having really deep conversations and getting really thoughtful questions from people who've read the book. That's really, really special. And I'll just say too, like, I'm of course a big reader, and I'm obsessed with Michigan fiction, especially work that's come out of Detroit and mid-Michigan. And like one of my heroes is Christopher Paul Curtis. We both went to Flint Southwestern. I got to meet him once at a book fair. He's the loveliest person on earth. So just like feeling that acknowledgement of like being part of this like Michigan lineage of writers, I guess. Being with these other Flint writers too in that history, just feels really good.
Well, now both, you can say that both you and him are Michigan Notable Book authors. So you're part of sort of a kinship group that not everybody is in. And something that is kind of cool is that he was a Night for Notables keynote speaker. Maybe, who knows, sometime in the future that could that would be kind of a sort of the cherry on the top. So definitely got to keep writing, so something like that could possibly I don't know, I think one of the best things that I took out of that event at Frankenmuth was that there was another library that showed up with
Yeah,
their
it
book club.
was
Like
such a
that they drove from Millington just because your book was part of the series of, because I think they did multiple notable books that year. They had also hosted one of the other authors, and that added more to the conversation. It was really great. So
absolutely, it's such an honor.
yeah. Why do you think people should read your book? I mean, we certainly talked a lot about like the different characters and aspects of it, but if you wanted to kind of summarize that down, what would be your sort of pitch, or say that, like, you should read this book and this is why?
Hmm. Oh, that's tough. I mean, I think if you're someone who is curious in any way about Flint's history or about the water crisis and
Mhm.
about what life is like in Flint behind the headlines. If you're a reader like me who loves like an intergenerational
Mhm.
novel, I love like Middlesex and The God of Small Things and East of Eden. Homegoing by Yagyasi is one of my recent favorites. The Turner House. I love all those books where you see the movement between like generations and how the relationship to places and relationships within the family, how they change over time.
Mhm.
There's also a lot of music references in it. I'm
Mhm.
a big music nerd. If you want some anecdotes about the night The Who opened for Herman's Hermits
Mhm.
at Atwood Stadium in Flint, or about Aretha Franklin's relationship to the water crisis,
Yeah.
I guess for you.
Yeah. I could see this. Something that came to mind when I was reading through it is that you could develop a curriculum that could go with this for a class, because of the relationship that it has with the history of Flint, and as a way to sort of introduce people to it. That with the Library of Michigan being part of the Department of Education, you're always thinking of like, well, what books out there could you have as like something that you could have within a classroom setting to make it a better transition for people to learn about Michigan history. And I think with this, that's something. Would you ever, did you ever think of maybe developing something like that for it, or was that ever on your radar?
No, I mean, that's incredibly flattering. And if there are any educators out there who are intrigued about that, I would love to come to your classroom. But no, that book is writing that book was so much a process of education,
Yeah.
me, of the research and conversations and reflection. Yeah.
So I think you mentioned a little bit earlier about some writers that have been your influence. Who's somebody or works that you've read recently that have been a good title that either has, inspired you for more of your reading, or just has been like a good leisure read and you're like, that was a good book I read lately. I'm glad I picked that one up. Anybody that comes to mind, any titles?
Right now, I'm deep in a writing project, drafting what is maybe going to be a novel someday. It's been really fun to work on, but I love movies, and I really love like historic movie theaters. Like
Mhm.
I live in Detroit where we have the Redford Theater and the Senate. Flint has the Capitol Theater. There's one in Saginaw I haven't been to. I think it's called the Temple. People
Mhm.
told me I should go. Um, yeah, but I love that like preservation of
Mhm.
film, the collective like experience of like the enthusiasm and excitement to revisit something, and maybe having like the live organ and
Mhm.
the whole thing. So anyway, that's not a book, but that's what I've been reading mostly is like
Mhm.
film histories. I
Yeah.
just read this really great history of Buster Keaton by
Okay.
Dana Stevens called The Cameraman. I really loved.
Yep.
Been spending some time at the archives of the Flint Public Library, like going through these beautifully, it was just like a local
Mhm.
amateur historian. I wish I remembered his name off the top of my head, but he collected and bound and donated to the Flint Public Library his scrapbooks, where from like vaudeville before there were theaters to the introduction of like silent films shown in theaters built for that purpose into the war, all the advertising for those movie theaters and like clips about it from like the Flint Journal or local papers. That's been really fun too.
Nice. You know, that cinema history of Michigan, it has its own long history, and I think, I mean, the first thing I think of is always Anatomy of a Murder. One time I got to go to the library in the UP where they filmed some of the scenes of that, and got to go up on the second floor, and it was an old Carnegie library, and I was like, oh, this is where Jimmy Stewart got to walk when they were filming this. So, you know, it'll be neat to see anything that comes out, it comes from you at that point. But I think, you know, just to wrap things up,
Where's UP?
Let's see, that was in, I think, either Nogany or Ishpeming. I want to say it was in Nogany. And I know somebody out there might correct me and say no, it was Ishpeming, but you'll have to double check that. I know it was in one of the Carnegie libraries up there. So if you read a little bit more about Anatomy of a Murder, you'll have to check some of the filming spots. So
I'll look that up. My sister works at a hardware store in Grosse Pointe Park that part of Clint Eastwood was there. It's where they shot part of Gran Torino.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, Kelsey, it has been great talking with you. It's been good. You know, like we said earlier, we've met before, but this is the first time that you and I've had a lengthy conversation. And I just hope that people get a chance to read Chevy in the Hole. It's a great 2023 notable book, and I'm glad that it's on the list, and really appreciate having the time to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was so fun.
All right. If anybody is looking for more information about our author conversations, they can go to michigan.gov/notable books and stay tuned for other interviews that we're going to be having with other 2023 Michigan notable authors. Thank you, everybody.